So we're going to speak about mechanisms of how the cell sets up its resting membrane potential. We talked about cells. We're going to look specifically at neurons today. So we're getting into talking about how neurons communicate. And they do so because of the resting membrane potential. This is what a neuron looks like while it's chilling, doing absolutely nothing. It's not excited. And basically, we're going to walk through the steps today of how that membrane potential was established. Okay, and so we're going to do so sequentially. We're going to take sodium, we're going to take potassium, and then we're going to look at them separately and combine them together. So when we talk about the resting membrane potential, we're really considering two ions, sodium and potassium, and we're considering the equilibrium potential of those ions. Now, in actuality, the resting membrane potential of a neuron takes other ions into account, such as chloride and calcium, but for the scope of this course, we're only going to be looking at sodium and potassium, and those are the most influential ions on the resting membrane potential anyhow, okay? So it exists because there's more negative inside the cell. We talked about this phenomenon. Inside the cell is more of a negative environment. Outside the cell is more positive, okay? And we're going to talk about how that comes to be throughout today. Now, all cells have a resting membrane potential. Again, it's sort of what the cell looks like in terms of its voltage when it's doing absolutely nothing. It's sort of just chilling out. So think about a neuron at rest, not excited or not firing an action potential. And so different cells have different resting membrane potentials, depending on where that cell is, whether it is an excitable cell, whether it's just a resting cell, a cardiac cell, a muscle cell, et cetera, et cetera. And that can be from anywhere from -5 millivolts all the way to -100 millivolts. But when we look at neurons specifically, the resting membrane potential of a neuron is -70 millivolts. And again, to remind ourselves, this means that the inside of the cell is -70, more negative, with respect to the outside of the cell, right? We're referencing the intracellular environment. Okay, so today's topic is really, how do we get there? How do we get to that -70? Okay, now we're going to talk about the equilibrium potentials for potassium and sodium, because those are what influence the resting membrane potential. And so we have two things that are setting up this potential. One is the concentration gradient of sodium and potassium. Okay, and that is basically what force? The concentration gradient is what type of force? A chemical force. Perfect. So the chemical force is basically the concentration gradient of these ions. That contributes to the resting membrane potential. And that is basically maintained in great detail by the sodium-potassium pump. We're going to talk about that pump in a little bit. There's also the membrane permeability to these ions. That is also very important in establishing the resting membrane potential. And when we speak about the membrane permeability to an ion, we're speaking about the channels. How many channels are there on that cell? Okay, so if there are lots of sodium channels, we say that the membrane is very permeable or very leaky to sodium. Whereas if it's not, we say that it's not as permeable. So think about permeability in the context of the number of channels that are on that neuron or on that cell. Okay. And what we'll see is that there are much more potassium channels on the cell. So if there's one doorway for sodium, there are about 25 times more potassium doorways. So the cell is much more permeable to potassium, simply because there are much more potassium channels. Now, when you look at this table, this is really to help you memorize some of the terminology that we've spoken about. At this point, you should know what the membrane potential is. You should know how to define it loosely. Same thing for the equilibrium potential of an ion. You should know what that means. And then we'll talk about some of the other terms as we go along. So this is a good reference point, not necessarily to memorize, but to be extremely familiar with, right? We're going to talk about these terms a lot, and you should have a good understanding as we mention them. All right, let's speak about the sodium-potassium pump. Very important pump, mechanism of active transport. We spoke about this. primary active transport to be specific. Now, it is responsible, 20% of the resting membrane potential is established by the sodium-potassium pump directly, right? So the sodium-potassium pump is directly responsible for 20% of the resting membrane potential. What does that really mean, right? That means that because of this pump, and let's remind ourselves, this pump is pumping 3 sodiums out and 2 potassiums in. Because of this pump, we're creating an environment where more positive charge is leaving the cell. All right, think about our 2 ions in question. Sodium, positively charged. Potassium, also positively charged. And so if we're pushing 3 sodiums out and 2 potassiums in, there's a net positive charge that's leaving the cell. So basically, over time, the inside of the cell will become more negative. All right, so 20% of the resting membrane potential is directly contributed to the sodium-potassium pump, and then 80% is indirectly contributed to the sodium-potassium pump. And what does that bit mean? So that also means that the sodium-potassium pump is what is maintaining those relative gradients. Okay, so sodium is going to be higher concentration outside, lower concentration inside. So where will sodium tend to want to go? Out, right? Whereas potassium is low outside, high inside. So where will potassium want to go? All right, let's do it again. Sodium is high on the outside, low on the inside. Where does sodium want to go? Inside. Sodium wants to go inside, okay? Think about the concentration gradient here. Potassium is low on the outside, right? Outside of the cell, low concentration. Inside of the cell, high concentration. What direction is potassium going to want to go? Outside of the cell, okay? And so because we have these leak channels which are allowing sodium and potassium to move along their relative concentration gradients, we maintain the resting membrane potential. So again, 80% of the resting membrane potential is indirectly due to the sodium-potassium pump. Okay, so let's speak about a typical neuron. We mentioned that it is 25 times more permeable to potassium. And again, that simply means that there are 25 more potassium channels than there are sodium channels. So for every sodium channel, we have 25 more, or 25 potassium channels. And basically, the increased permeability of the cell to potassium is what is really helping to influence this resting membrane potential. By the end of today, we'll see what that means. Potassium is very much influential on what this resting membrane potential is. And just to remind ourselves what the distribution of ions look like across a typical neuron, outside of the neuron, we have sodium and chloride. Right? Sodium is positive, chloride is negative, and so those two different charges balance each other out on the outside of the cell. Likewise, inside the neuron, we have potassium, positively charged, and we have other organic anions. Think about DNA, which is negatively charged, proteins, amino acids. They are negatively charged, and they help to combat or balance that positive charge of potassium inside the cell. Okay? So basically, between this separation or distribution of ions, we have a relative state of balance, right? We have positive and negative outside, we have positive and negative inside, and that's how we start off, right? This is not at rest yet. This is how a neuron starts off. Let's see what happens here. Right, so as I mentioned earlier, we're going to consider the equilibrium potential of potassium. We're going to look at a hypothetical cell which only takes the movement of potassium into account. All right, I'm going to go very slow here so that I don't lose you guys. So the movement of potassium is what we're looking at solely at this first part. Then we'll look at the equilibrium potential of sodium, okay, in a hypothetical cell that is only permeable to sodium. And then we will combine those two influences and see what they do in terms of establishing the resting membrane potential. Remember, we said that both of those equilibrium potentials contribute to the resting membrane potential. So let's consider the equilibrium potential of potassium. And let's take this hypothetical cell. So the cell is only permeable to potassium, right? That's the hypothetical situation here. But it still has these relative ion concentrations on either side of the cell, right? So think about the cell that is still existing in normal physiological conditions. It is only allowing the movement of potassium, however. And we first look at the chemical driving force of potassium on this cell. Now we have a high concentration of potassium inside the cell. This we know to be true, and a lower concentration of potassium outside the cell. So this creates, very simply, a chemical driving force where potassium wants to move down its concentration gradient, which is out of the cell. Okay, this is your chemical driving force. Let's add to this, because we know that the chemical driving force is not the only force acting on potassium. What is the other force that we have to consider? The electrical driving force. So now, as potassium is moving out of the cell, we now have to consider that the inside of the cell becomes more negative, right? And potassium is positively charged. So the electrical force will be on what direction for potassium? Inside the cell. Inside the cell. Let's say that again. So as potassium starts to move along its chemical force, leaving this unopposed negative charge inside, right? Potassium's leaving. Now we create this environment. Inside the cell becomes more negative, and so we set up an electrical force at this point where potassium wants to go in the opposite direction. It wants to get back closer to that negative charge because it is positively charged. All right, so what we end up here with in terms of considering the electrochemical driving force is that there are two forces acting in the opposite direction, right? One stronger than the other, right? There's an electrical driving force that's sort of pulling potassium back into the cell. And we know what to do when we have two forces, don't we? We should know from that flow chart we talked about in Unit 1, what we do when we have two forces acting in the opposite direction. What do we do? We look at the more influential force or the stronger force, and we simply subtract the weaker force from that, okay? All right, so eventually the cell gets to equilibrium, right? This is how we get to potassium's equilibrium potential. We have potassium trying to leave the cell because of its chemical force, and also trying to enter the cell because of its electrical force. And so when this ion finally gets to equilibrium, what is happening at equilibrium? We should know this. What is happening at equilibrium? In terms of the net movement of potassium, there's no net movement of potassium. When we get to equilibrium, which for potassium is negative 94 millivolts, that is the membrane potential where potassium stops moving. That is how we get to potassium's equilibrium potential. We consider its forces acting in opposite directions, and when those forces equalize, right, and so they net out, meaning that they're equal and opposite, we have no net movement of potassium. And so potassium gets to its equilibrium potential where the forces are equal and opposite here, okay? And so this is how we establish potassium's equilibrium potential. Okay. All right, so pretty much what we just mentioned, at equilibrium, there's no net movement because our ECDF is 0, right? So we talked about how we go from looking at one force of potassium, looking at the other force of potassium, combining those forces and finding out what potassium's equilibrium potential is, right? We know that to be negative 94 millivolts, and we figured out how we got there. Let's look at sodium. Let's look at sodium here. Again, considering a hypothetical cell only permeable to sodium ions, okay? The relative concentration of ions on either side of the cell are the same. We have chloride and potassium inside. We have sodium, we have sodium and chloride outside. We have potassium and other ions inside, okay? But this cell is only permeable to sodium. Let's start again by looking at the chemical force of sodium. Again, we're trying to figure out how do we get to sodium's equilibrium potential. And we're sort of walking our way to find that. So considering the sodium gradient, or considering the concentration gradient of sodium, we see that there's more sodium outside the cell, that we know to be true, and less inside the cell. So again, very simply, the chemical driving force wants to move sodium in what direction? Into the cell, inside of the cell, right? Down or along its concentration gradient. So that's the CDF of sodium on a neuron. Let's look at adding the electrical force into it, right? We know, again, I keep saying this, chemical and electrical forces don't act singly on a particle, right? You have to combine them. Both forces are acting on a particle across the membrane. So let's take the electrical force into consideration here. As sodium diffuses into the cell, like that's along its concentration gradient, what do we leave outside, right? The inside of the cell is now more positive, right? Sodium's coming in. So what's the electrical force for sodium? Sorry? It's positively charged. And where of the cell would it want to go? Huh? It wants to go outside, right? It wants to go to that negative environment. Let's recap that again. We have sodium coming into the cell. As it enters the cell, it leaves this unopposed negative charge outside, right? We talked about those balancing forces. Chloride is balancing the sodium outside, whereas those anions are balancing potassium inside. So if we're moving sodium into the cell along its concentration gradient, we leave a negative environment outside. There's no longer that sodium to counteract or balance that chloride outside. So the outside becomes more negative, the inside becomes more positive. And so what we have are two forces in the opposite direction once again. A chemical force going in and an electrical force going out. Okay, does everyone understand how we got this? Again, this is a hypothetical cell only permeable to the movement of sodium. Okay, this is not what happens actually. Okay, now sodium begins to move and it eventually gets to equilibrium, just like we saw with potassium. At equilibrium, again, we have these two opposing forces in equal of magnitude, but in the opposite direction. And so when we get to this state where sodium is no longer moving in terms of its net movement, this is how we get to sodium's equilibrium potential, or this is sodium's equilibrium potential, okay? So at this state, at this voltage, positive 60, sodium is at equilibrium, right? There's no net movement of sodium because the forces are equal and opposite.